My Lords, may I start by congratulating all those who've made their maiden speech in the course of this debate, and say that, of course, they're excellent speeches and they'll make a great contribution to the House in the future. The one I just wanted to sort of respond to at the moment was that by the noble Lord Cryer, with his reference to 1920s capitalism. I look forward very much, I hope, to having a drink with him one evening when we can discuss the very different attitudes that capitalism had to free markets in the 1920s. I remember Lord Ashfield, who chaired and brought together the London Underground, London transport system in the private sector over a period of 30 years, in his shareholder letters, could hardly bring himself to use the word competition, and if he did, it was always coupled with the adjective wasteful, normally following the verb eliminate. We must eliminate wasteful competition, he said quite nakedly to his shareholders. And his attitude to free markets and that of Mrs. Thatcher must be regarded as two very different aspects of capitalism. It's not easily confused. May I also welcome the noble Baroness, the Minister, to her place, and may I thank all those who have contributed to the debate. It's invidious to mention any names, but I do want to select, if I may, the speech by my noble friend Lord Young of Cookham, who set out with great lucidity the problems that privatisation were meant to address. And if privatisation has, to a degree, failed by whatever measure we choose to apply to it, the essential point of his speech was that the problems have not gone away. They are essentially the same problems, and the government is going to have to come up with different solutions to them. So far, we have seen nothing of that. Now, we can all agree that reform to some degree of the railways is necessary, and the last government initiated that process with the Williams Review. It contained many detailed recommendations, for example, on fares and ticketing and other matters, that I imagine will appear in the promised rail reform bill next year or whenever it appears. Indeed, given it is several years since Williams reported, I'm surprised that the government actually needs a further year to bring that bill forward. My fear is that, rather like the last government, the complexities involved may be so great that we never actually see it. And that today's bill, and this is an important point, far from being an interim measure, could end up being a sort of permanent state. Now, the Williams Review was widely welcomed cross-party, and the part of it that's most relevant to the debate we're having today and to this bill is the part concerned with the structure and franchising of the railways. The model envisaged by Williams, and this was referred to by the noble Baroness Lady Pigeon in her speech, was one based on a successful model that is used by Transport for London for all its services other than London Underground, which is directly provided. And that model differs from the current arrangements on National Rail. The key difference is that the fares risk is carried by Transport for London, by contrast to the rail privatisation model, which sought to transfer that risk to the train operating companies. Now, that aspect of rail privatisation has never worked well, because fares risk, it turns out, is actually closely linked to the economic cycle. As the economy booms, more people take trains, and if there's a recession, fewer people take trains and the fares fall. And that is a well-demonstrated economic phenomenon. But it's something which the train operating companies are totally incapable of managing. They can't manage the economic cycle. And so, as each franchise has been renewed over time, what we have seen is the Department for Transport agreeing contracts, franchises, whereby more and more of the fares risk remains with the Department for Transport, and therefore with HM Treasury. And this was a process that was brought to its ultimate logical conclusion by the pandemic when there were no fares at all, and all of the fares risk was transferred to the Department for Transport, where it has largely remained under the contracts that have been renewed since then, even as passenger numbers have picked up and the fares go straight to the government. So the TfL model, by contrast, leaves the private sector responsible for managing the risks that they're actually equipped to manage. So, namely, for trains, for buses, for trams, having the trains, trams and buses in the right place at the beginning of every day, pointed in the right direction, with the appropriate staff on them, to an agreed standard of cleanliness, all the things that train operating companies are good at managing. And if they fail to manage them, of course, properly, they receive a financial penalty. And this system, we know, is one that works, demonstrably works, which is no doubt why Keith Williams recommended its adoption on national rail as a former TfL board member, as indeed I am. But that was not what the unions wanted, and I don't like to bring the unions into this after the minatory comments of my noble friend Lord Balfe, and I would say that I am actually quite friendly towards trades unions. But I do want him to just reflect for a moment that one of the objectives of the unions and one of the consequences of this bill is that if there is a national strike on the railways in the future, then his ability to get to Cambridge by one of the 3 alternative lines that currently serves him and which allow him to escape the effects of the strike if there is a strike on one line, that ability will be taken from him, and he will be marooned in Cambridge and unable to put his services at the disposal of your lordship's house if there is a national strike, which is, of course, what the trades unions would like to, the power that they would like to be able to exercise. So that prescription, that part of the Williams prescription, has been junked, and instead the phrase single employer has crept into the debate, appearing in Labour documents. There is to be a single employer with single terms and conditions. And that is a very different thing from Williams, and something which does not have cross-party support. We are moving from a tried and tested system recommended by Williams, tried and tested by TfL, to one that actually isn't tried and tested at all, or if it was in the period of the Attlee government and the 1950s. We run the risk, the government runs the risk, that the logo of Great British Railways is going to be the curly British Rail sandwich that some of us are old enough to remember. Now, the logic behind the bill, my lords, and it's not without merit, there is a case for it, is that the network effects of the railways require a single controlling brain. But that single controlling brain largely exists at the moment. And following the scrapping of the Strategic Rail Authority, it sits quite explicitly in the Department for Transport. The Department for Transport, which awards the franchises, runs the system, is the controlling brain. And the creation of Great British Railways is an admission that the Department for Transport has failed in that role. But a single controlling brain does not necessarily mean that you need a single operating arm, as TfL illustrates. And there are inconsistencies in the approach, logical inconsistencies, in the bill, the first of which relates to devolution. If there is an argument for a single controlling brain to control a national network, a single network, how does that fit with devolution? How does it fit, as several noble lords have asked, with a system whereby in London, the most congested and busiest part of the network, you actually are going to have 2 competing networks? You have a network run by TfL, which is using the private sector, and a network run by Great British Railways, often on the same tracks, services often on the same tracks, from which the private sector is going to be banned. How can it be that the private sector is unacceptable on some services on those tracks, but perfectly fine on others. The government has no answer to the question about London, no coherent answer as to what it is going to do. It could say we're just going to leave it alone and not do anything with it. But of course the mayor has been accreting to himself responsibility for additional lines in London over time, and he wants more, and there is an argument that he should have more. Are we to see a moratorium on that move of lines, responsibility for lines, from Network Rail to the mayor? Is it all going to be frozen just as it is? Or are we going to allow that process to continue? Or are we going to reverse it in the interests of having the single controlling brain and the logic that exists behind Great British Railways? We have absolutely no idea. And even if all those services provided by TfL were not provided by the private sector, then the question would still arise. It's the logical question of two different brains. The other problem is to do with open access. The government says it is in favour of open access, but of course logically it shouldn't be in favour of open access if it believes in a single brain and a single operating arm. Many of us are sceptical about whether the government is truly committed to open access. And yet, on the other hand, as the my noble friend Lord Young of Cookham pointed out, in the European Union, open access, which has been pursued with great vigour in recent years under European Union law mandating open access, it is incidentally the fact that we're going in the direction we're going in is a Brexit bonus, I might say. I don't think the government has fully appreciated the difficulties they'd have with this enactment if we were still members of the European Union. But we have a report. We have a report here that was published only in August by the European Commission on the benefits that have accrued from open access. And what they find is that where competition is more mature, the following effects could be noticed: lower fares, potential cost reductions, increased frequencies, improved services. And specifically on fares, they say, on average, ticket prices have decreased by 28% on the selected case studies due to a non-incumbent operator entering the market. The government has decided to turn its back on all of this. Perhaps the cool reception that the Prime Minister had when he met Mrs. von der Leyen not so long ago followed his explaining to her that he was about to exclude from access to British Railways the many European companies who operate on it already and who might want to bid for services in the future. That may have explained quite a great deal, I don't know. As the debate has made clear, and the government has not really denied this, this is a rushed bill. And the result of that is that we're told in the impact assessment that accompanies it that there has been no time to look at alternative models. The impact assessment here actually says, I'll quote very briefly one sentence, the bill has been prepared to enable swift delivery of a government manifesto commitment, not to improve matters for passengers, but to enable the swift delivery of a government manifesto commitment. As such, it has not been practicable for the department to undertake the usual long listing process, that is, the long listing of options that might be legislated for instead. And so that's what we're getting, a rushed bill with no alternative solutions. And yet the debate today in your Lordship's House has indicated an appetite for that. My Lords, I've tried to address the broad principles underlying the organisation of the railways. It's been suggested that this is a trivial and tiny bill, that all the serious discussion is going to happen in a year's time or whenever the rail bill comes. But actually, as the debate has made clear, this bill is pregnant with huge consequences for the future, and that's especially true if the future gets pushed off further and further into the future. I mean, even if the government meets its timetable and has a bill in front of your Lordship's House 12 months from now, it will still take several years to implement that bill in practice. And so what we're setting up today could be the shadow arrangements that we're living with for many years. But we've had no serious discussion from the government about issues such as performance monitoring and accountability. I've mentioned devolution and open access. We do not understand where the investment is going to come from in future. The question has been repeatedly asked by noble lords. We have had no discussion. The noble Baroness Lady Brinton at the end brought in the important question of industrial relations and terms and conditions. We do not know how that is going to work when people are tupied across to government employment, given that they have... What is the cost of that going to be? How is that going to be affordable? There's a further point, which is what is the consequence of bringing the pension liabilities of the train operating companies presumably over onto the government balance sheet, and what effect will that have on the public finances? I think, of course, there is an opportunity for us to discuss all of those things in committee, and I look forward to doing that when the time comes in a couple of weeks.